It's Thursday, the 12th of January. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Bob Seely, Labour's Siobhan McDonough, The Guardian's political editor Pippa Crerar, and author and broadcaster Timandra Harkness. On today's programme,
the disgusting anti-Semitic, anti-vax conspiracy theories that have been promulgated online are not only deeply offensive but anti-scientific.
Andrew Bridgen is suspended from the Tory party over anti-vax comments. But how do we balance censorship and free speech? As low-emission zones expand across Britain, can we really afford to pursue environmental policies like these? We'll be joined by Howard Cox from Fair Fuel UK, who thinks we can't.
Our growth plan will look at how we can support those who can to move back into work, including through the welfare system.
Rishi Sunak wants to get people back into work. Could letting them keep their benefits be an incentive? And as the cost of living continues to bite and the Ukraine war wages on, are there any reasons to be hopeful? Well, let's stick broadly with that theme. Let me show you a couple of headlines. This, first of all, in the Daily Telegraph. 750,000 could soon default on mortgage. This is a report in the paper saying that that many households are at risk of defaulting on their mortgages over the next 2 years. And this in The Guardian, fury as millions on prepay energy meters plunged into dark and cold. Ministers are being urged to stop the forced installation of prepayment meters after revelations that 3.2 million people were left with cold and dark homes last year as they ran out of credit. Further evidence, Bob, starting with you, of all the pressures people are facing on the cost of living. Do you feel any hope that things will improve this year?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do, because the spot price for liquid natural gas has been falling since the summer, and I think it will continue to fall quite sharply. This will have a significant impact on inflation. Look, and one of the reasons why we can't give people the pay increases, the pay awards that they want, is because we have to think of the nation and the public finances, and we have got to get inflation down, because inflation hurts everybody. So the more we have falling energy prices, and the more people can be responsible in the pay claims, despite the fact that we have very hard times at the moment. We've got some of the worst inflation for 25, 30 years. We need to get that down. And it's one of Rishi's 5 promises for this year, to get inflation down, to get the economy growing, to get debt falling, and actually to get strike legislation through, which for me is absolutely critical. I wish we'd done it before Christmas. We need to get on and do it as soon as possible.
But in the meantime, people have got to manage. But you're still hopeful?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm confident about the next year, and I'm confident for us. Look, I think we had a dreadful time last year, and I apologise. And I think, I like Rishi, I think he's going to be a great leader. I think charismatic, dynamic, and I think we're going to get back on track, and we will be delivering for the British people. Siobhan,
you probably feel differently, but do you have any hope, reasons to be hopeful?
I think that gas and electricity prices will ease, but the fundamentals out there are really hard. People who have 2-year fixed mortgage deals are likely to find when they try and sign up to a new mortgage could be £500 a month more. Food prices are still increasing hugely, and the people who are the poorest spend more of their money on essentials like that. And I was really interested to see the thing about the prepayment meters, because I was talking to the chief executive of a local housing association in my constituency, and she was telling me for the first time in a career of over 30 years, they have to make sure that their contractors doing repair have cash in their pockets to recharge the key meters, because they go into so many homes that have no gas and no electricity. And we're all becoming much more aware of the impact and damp and mould growth on children and vulnerable people's lungs. So there is so much stuff out there. I don't want to be miserable. That's not my starting position. But the challenges are there. And I suppose at least we're talking about them, and to address them, you've got to start and be aware of what's going on.
Well, I'll come. Yeah, go on, Bob. Then
I was just going to say that the most important thing there is on the interest rates, which you're completely right to point out, is that we've got to get interest rates down, and the best way to do that is to get inflation down. And we still have a relatively high. We have a high employment economy still, despite increased hardship.
We have a high employment, low income economy, which is our real challenge, because poverty exists not exclusively amongst people on benefits, but on those who are in work, who simply cannot manage. And when you combine that with childcare costs, you're talking about people and families who we would regard as quite well off.
That's what we're dealing with this year. That's one of the things we're dealing with this year.
All right, what about...
Let's see you deal with it.
We've seen the illustration. We've seen illustrations of varying pressures that are continuing on people. Do you have any reasons to be hopeful for this year, Pippa?
Always. I'm a glass half full person, and I think you have to be. But there's no denying the fact that a lot of people are finding life really hard just now, whether it's their energy bills, whether it's their food shop, whether it's prospect of mortgages going up. And there are bigger structural issues as well, which government needs to address. I mean, one's mentioned housing, but of course there's, you know, NHS and the sort of pressures that are on public services more generally, which are really difficult. And some of them won't be solved overnight. But I'm very conscious that there's an election just probably about 18 months away. So I think we'll start hearing a lot from both main parties, about hope and visions for the future. And so I think that people like our job, your job, to hold them to account, to make sure that they don't just talk about a better future, they actually deliver it.
Yeah, you've got to see the action. What about for you? Reasons to be hopeful?
Well, I think in the short term, yes, probably fuel and energy prices will fall. But unfortunately, I'm not as hopeful as I'd like to be, because I think it's not just a short-term economic crisis. I mean, energy prices were already high before Putin invaded Ukraine, and productivity in Britain has been very low for a number of years. Average incomes in Britain have been below equivalent countries like Australia and some of Europe for years. We're quite a poor, low productivity country. I'm afraid, unlike Bob, one of the things that gives me hope is the number of people who are going on strike and saying, look, we just can't, we've had below inflation pay rises for a decade, we cannot go on like this, we are worth more than this, we need more than this, and a lot of them having quite widespread public support.
Well, Timandra mentions the war in Ukraine. I mean, Bob, will the cost of living squeeze here and very high inflation not come to an end until we see a conclusion to the war in Ukraine?
No, because I think people are now, companies, the international markets are producing more liquid natural gas, liquefied natural gas, and there's more gas getting to the markets. And actually, because there's a slowdown in the economy in China, that is actually helping us with the supply. Look, I mean, you can be as critical as you like. Actually, we haven't had below inflation pay rises for the last decade. We're having low inflation pay rises now because we have a significant inflation spike, and I think it's important.
But
just
pay
to get
has remained broadly flat over.
No, sorry, it has been increasing, but. Pippa, can I just answer a point? Pippa made a really important point about the NHS, what's happening on it. There is short-term and medium-term stuff that is having a really positive effect. And if I can just give you two examples from my own patch on the Isle of Wight, because it's somewhere I know about. The Winter Discharge Fund means that we were able to partially reopen an old folks' home called Bluebells. That freed up nearly 24 beds to get people who'd had their operations into Bluebells, so we could free up a good-sized ward in St Mary's and the NHS to get more people through, to get their operations successfully done. So that is an example of actually just firing up money to do short term. The medium term is the discharge.
Let's finish your point and then I'll come to you.
The medium term stuff we're doing is speeding up checks, and scans and tests through the diagnostic centres.
All right. Well, that's one example. That's one example of good. That's one example of good practice. You were going to say.
I'm delighted for Bob and his constituents, but that's not the experience of most people who are currently using the A&E. The crisis in GP and primary care, we've read, seen, experienced the length of time that people are waiting in A&Es. Anybody with a relative who is unwell fears having to go near the GP or go near the hospital because we don't want to put our loved one in that position of experiencing that. I mean,
so that's why we've got another $1.5 billion, another 50 million GPs
Bob's
appointments.
Experience is worthwhile. My personal experience is worthwhile. My sister's GP took 3 weeks to look at a urine sample, only to give me an appointment 2 weeks later to tell me that they couldn't test it. I mean,
Are you in favour, by the way, I asked this yesterday of the Labour MP, are you in favour then of this new idea from Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary?
Absolutely.
Oh, you are?
And with Wes, it's not just Wes's, respect to Wes, but this idea about GPs relates back to Aradazi, the internationally known cardiac surgeon. In our big cities,
but you're not all
our
agreed on. The problem is you're not all agreed on that.
Our GP service is on its knees.
Sorry, Siobhan,
well, just finally one example, because we must move on. But yes, go on.
Again, another example in my patch. We have somewhere called the Lighthouse Clinic. It's the best dermatology clinic in the country. We need it because we have
But you would agree it's patchy? Provision across the country.
But you're saying to nationalise GPs, you're going to spend a fortune.
This is Labour's
you don't all agree on it, and you're going to spend a fortune buying out GP surgeries in order to get basically the same service you've got now. The way to do that is to get more GPs. Last year of Labour government in power.
Please
let me finish the point.
But you
not
clearly
interrupt.
haven't done that.
Well, we have, and
There's
if you let
been
me
no
finish,
growth in
I will give you the
GPs.
point.
There are 4,500 fewer GPs today than there were a few years ago.
Sorry, this is just untrue.
There are fewer nurses
can I just answer that point?
Don't talk over each other, but there are people leaving the profession,
in the last year of the Labour government, there were 97,000 GPs. There are now doctors in the country.
Well,
there were now 132,000. There were, last year of the Labour government, 270,000 nurses. Please let me finish. There are now over 320.
But one would say the demands are much greater.
Have you not noticed that the population has increased? Have you not noticed
to say that there are few doctors and nurses, Siobhan, is simply untrue.
Don't talk over each other.
You can say it, but it is not true.
But you are presenting an experience of the NHS that people simply do not share with you.
All right.
Last week,
I'm putting facts out there, which are facts.
Last week, my local hospitals, we were talking about it earlier on, St Helier and St George's announced major incidents because they could not cope with the numbers of people coming through their doors.
I think it underlines how important the discussion around the NHS has been and will continue to be so. We're going to talk about low emissions zones, or what the government calls clean air zones. More and more cities in Britain are introducing them. This is the idea of either banning cars from some city centres or imposing charges on heavily polluting vehicles to drive into city centres. You can see here areas that currently have low emission zones: Bath, Birmingham, Bradford, Bristol, Portsmouth, London, Oxford and Glasgow, and cities planning to introduce them: Manchester, Sheffield, Tyneside, Aberdeen, Dundee and Edinburgh. And just to say, the schemes are not all the same and the rules vary in terms of which vehicles are allowed into city centres, at what cost and when. My question to all of you is, can we afford low emission zones when we're facing a cost of living crisis, Tamandra?
Well, no, but this is where who we is becomes really interesting, because if we is young, healthy people living in cities with good public transport, then who I suspect are a lot of the people who make the policies in this, they go, well, that's fine, I can cycle and get the bus, everybody should be doing this, the air will be cleaner. If you are somebody maybe who works and also has small children, so you need to get them to school and get to work, if you work irregular hours, suppose you're a care worker that goes from home to home, or you're a plumber and you need to carry tools and materials, then you cannot do without a vehicle. You cannot necessarily replace a vehicle overnight just like that. And so either you're going to be maybe priced out of your job altogether, or your costs go up, or you simply have to keep paying the charge to keep using your vehicle, and all your costs go up, and maybe your cost to the customers go up.
Pippa?
I think it is expensive, but we have to, longer term, come up with solutions. And I don't think you're going to reverse any of those schemes that you showed us on the map. And they may need a bit of tweaking over time to make sure that they fit. And of course, you're absolutely right that there's a differences in places like Southwark, for example, where I live, in a London council, where 2/3 of people don't own a car because public transport is very reliable, because it's close enough to central London to walk or to cycle. And places like Burnley, where my in-laws live, where they have to be more reliant on getting buses in, they come maybe once an hour, and therefore people are more reliant on cars. But it's not just about saving the planet, as lots of people seem to think. It's also about health. I mean, we've seen examples, particularly, it's also about social justice, because if you're thinking about the people that are affected in cities by air pollution, I mean, London, there's been some really notable examples. There's that wee girl, Ella Kissy Deborah, the 9-year-old who had asthma. The schools with a poor demographic tend to be closer to busy main roads, and therefore people are more impacted by pollution. It's also about traffic, and if you take people that don't need to use their cars, and we've all, I mean, I own a car and I live in central London, and sometimes I use it when I don't need to. If you take people like me off the roads, then you can have mitigations in place for people that do need it, whether it's to take elderly relatives to appointments at hospitals, whether it's to take children, you know, somewhere you can't access by public transport, and crucially for small businesses that rely on their vehicles to get around, you can have those mitigations in place. So it doesn't need to be a sort of black or white solution.
Who gets to decide that this is an essential journey and that's not an essential journey?
So I think there's quite obvious parameters around, you know, me taking my kids to school on a Tuesday morning because we couldn't be bothered to get out of bed 10 minutes early, so we get the car rather than the bus, is not an essential journey. You taking your elderly mother to a hospital appointment is an essential journey. And of course there'll be nuance in between.
But that still presupposes that somebody's going, OK, well, I'm going to decide your journey is not necessary, your journey is necessary, your journey is not necessary. I actually think mobility is a really good thing. I think the ability to move around and do more things in the time that we have on this earth, which is what motorised transport enables us to do.
But then you'd have less time on the earth if you live in a busy city.
I do live in a busy city and I live on a main road, which is one of the roads that traffic gets diverted onto when they have low traffic neighbourhoods around it.
Unfortunately, you won't have as much time on this earth as a result of that, because statistically in London, thousands of people die earlier by virtue of traffic pollution than they otherwise would.
But these schemes do not address that. They don't say, let us... I mean, for example, you know, one scheme I think is good is trying to get taxis away from old diesel engines into electric. I know that usually involves taxi drivers spending a lot of money to shift. So you take the dirtiest vehicles and you turn them electric. What these schemes do is they charge individuals in order to use their vehicles and to be able to move around.
All right.
And I think it's completely the wrong approach.
Well,
you're essentially trying to reduce mobility. You're trying to say, oh, well, you should only go to things within 15 minutes walk of your house. If I wanted to do that, I'd live in a village.
Well, hold on to that, because we're going to expand the discussion, but just to get your initial thoughts, are these a good idea, these low emission zones, and expanding them, particularly since in London they're going to, Sadiq Khan plans to expand the ultra low emission zone to take in your constituency. Right. So your constituents will have to pay the £12.50 to drive a polluting vehicle on top of the congestion charge.
It's going to be devastating. There are large numbers of people who they're actually being asked to pay £12.50 a day to take their car off their drive. Now, I completely understand it's done with the best of intentions, all the environmental issues.
Only old cars, I should say. Anything about 5 years
absolutely.
and more, which is the majority of cars.
And you're right, and it's really important that people know which cars it is, which is a challenge in itself. But nevertheless, I have constituents contacting me who can't carry on their building businesses. I have people who are carers who drive to their clients who they don't earn £12.50 an hour.
So those are the people who the mitigations should be in place for.
Well, you need to make the scheme as sophisticated.
And this is from a Labour. And this is from a Labour mayor. Well, hang on. I'm going to come to you in a minute, but I'm going to bring in Howard Cox from Fair Fuel UK. He's in Kent. He's also lobbying the Transport Minister, I understand, Howard Mark Harper, to overturn Mayor Sadiq Khan's move to expand the zone. But can we afford not to introduce low emission zones in the way you will have heard from Pippa Crerar here?
Yeah, good afternoon. Nice to be on your show. Fundamentally, what is missed in all of these conversations is that every single driver wants to breathe clean air, but not at the expense of taking something out of the pocket. Most of these plans are made by clueless local politicos who don't have an ounce of common sense road user strategic planning in them. What we need to do is develop clean fuel technology and incentivise people to move to cleaner fuels, not stop their freedom of travel. And you're right about what makes an essential journey is, in one of your speakers just now, what does make an essential journey is a freedom of to drive. I don't want a local elected politician to tell me where I can go and how I actually go by what form of transport.
Bob?
I have a lot of sympathy with what Howard says. I also have a lot of sympathy with Pippa's argument. Look, there is an issue of social justice. If you're poorer, the quality of air you breathe is worse, and that affects you. And actually the noise pollution. So if you're talking about young people, not only are they breathing in some horrible fumes, and actually I breathe in diesel, it makes me feel physically ill, but if you live on main roads, your sleep is much more likely to be interrupted, you're going to do worse at school, your life chances suffer. So that is really important.
So would you support Howard's campaign?
But I just think if you're going to do green measures that cost small businesses money, the time to do that is when we have a growing economy or our economy is growing faster. So I would not necessarily introduce these measures now. I would hold them off until, as Howard says, the technology is there to do it more easily and to put fewer economic costs on people, because if you have a shrinking economy, it is more difficult to do things. If you have a growing economy, it is easier to make those changes because people can add cost to their business without losing business. They can add cost to their business and still employ new people because their businesses grow. So this is a question of judgment and balance over time.
So is it the wrong time to do it? Is Sadiq Khan a clueless politician?
Yep.
Well, no, I wasn't. I'm sure that's what you think. I was asking Siobhan, who from the same party.
Clearly, he's not clueless. But on this, I just think it is the wrong time, and I think it's targeting people who are having the hardest of times. And but
when is a good time? I mean, when is there a good time? As Pippa said, you may not be around. We may not be around long enough to find out.
There are times that are easier than they are now. But I have to say, there will be more over 50s jobless and on benefits. If this happens in my constituency, there will be fewer carers because they just can't do it. And, it's with... I appreciate that Sadiq wants to do a really good thing, but at the moment, the way it's being introduced is challenging those who have the least ability to fight back.
The problem is Keir Starmer's committed very much broadly to environmental policies. Yes, within that also specifically climate change policies. But is it going to be difficult when you hit reality with some of these policies in the way we're discussing now?
These things always are. I mean, just saying something is difficult means it actually is difficult to do. And there are absolutely valid arguments about when you do these things. And, I share the concern that people are obviously facing a huge amount of pressure financially at the moment, and therefore judgments need to be made by these city leaders across the country as to when they do this. I also think that there has to be the capacity for a more sophisticated system with inbuilt mitigation, and that none of these schemes are perfect immediately. They're going to be introduced and hopefully tweaks will be made. But in some cases, maybe those tweaks should be made before they're imposed.
I mean, Howard, what's your response to what you've heard? Because government research released last year says that air pollution is the largest environmental risk to public health in the UK. We can't wait.
Well, I understand this, and I repeat what I said earlier. Everyone wants to breathe cleaner air. But next week, I'm publishing a poll. It's running at the moment. 50,000 road users right across the country have taken part, and we've asked the question, what is the impact of restrictions in cities driving now? And 64%, that's 2 out of 3 of respondents, have said it's purely a local council cash grab because they're starved of national funding from central government now. So they're using any way possible to actually raise funds. It's not about, it is green virtual signalling that's going on. Please don't have a go at me for saying I'm not denying climate change. I'm just denying the fact is that people can't afford this at this time, and that most of the people in your studio agree with that.
Right, green virtue signalling, though, is that what these schemes are, Bob?
They can be at their worst, at their best.
But what does that mean at their worst? There's either a scheme or there isn't a scheme.
Pippa got it right. If this is done well, it's great to have a good idea, but a good idea done badly is a good idea done badly. A good idea implemented well with a great policy that's actually well thought through improves people's lives. And fundamentally, politics is about coming up with good ideas, implementing them properly for the benefit of the public good. That's politics. And if you come up with a good idea, and look, Labour's net zero by 2030, it's a great idea. Absolutely clueless because it is absolutely unachievable, and they will get absolutely slated come the next election because it is simply not achievable within that time frame. You have to be realistic, and so good politics done badly is bad politics. Good politics done well is good politics, and what Howard says is basically
I'm not really sure I'm going to take any lectures from the Conservative MPs and where we are.
It's a point.
The thing is, when we introduce policy, we have to make sure that those people impacted by it can actually sustain it and manage it. And if we look at the way the green grants system has worked to improve the insulation in your home, it's always people who live in bigger, more expensive houses who can actually afford to do it. People with nothing don't have the finances to do it. So what I'm trying to say is that when you come up with a good idea, I appreciate I'm talking about a London mayor, but you asked me a question on behalf of my constituents and the people I see, and exists to support.
And will you be
so
happy
I will do that without fear or favour.
Siobhan, we should write to the Labour Mayor telling him what a bad
I have
idea
no
this
idea.
is.
I don't want us to be
it's all right.
we.
We've got Howard.
I don't want us to be we. We are not we. We do not want the same thing. You don't see the NHS and the crisis it's in. You're in a level of denial.
We're not going to return to the NHS. Just a final word from Howard. I mean, you're campaigning against Sadiq Khan expanding this zone. How far have you got? It looks like it's going ahead.
It is going ahead in August, that's right. But next week we publish some information that is pretty damning to Sadiq Khan, which I can't reveal at the moment. No, well, I would, like I'm on your show next week to do.
Very good.
But it is. But I've just got a text from someone who says reducing traffic in cities makes it difficult for those with mobility issues to get into, enjoy our cities, and I'm not just referring to those in wheelchairs, but those who can only walk short distances. Go figure.
Howard, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to look at this headline in The Times. Go to work and keep disability payments. Benefits revamp aimed at boosting economy. It's reporting that the government's considering allowing people who are out of work and receiving sickness benefits to keep those benefits even after they return to work. We're talking around 2.5 million people who are out of work because of medical conditions, according to the latest official figures. That is a sizable increase since the start of the coronavirus pandemic, when the number was around 2 million. Good idea?
Yes, I think so. I think broadly it's good for people to be working, it's good for people to be active in society, just purely from their own individual point of view. It's always better for people to be engaged in life and to be contributing something and to be focusing on their abilities and what they can do rather than their disabilities.
And keeping the payments and benefits while they do so?
Well, I mean, I think there is clearly a disincentive to people to say, actually, you know what, I can do that when the concomitant of that is that money gets taken away. But I think it's part of a much broader problem. I hesitate to say that our society incentivises people to be ill or disabled, because I think that's kind of insulting to people who are getting by on very little, with very little public support, with long-term disabilities. But I do think there's a sense in which we're encouraged to see difficulties and challenges as a disability that then defines us to some extent and then becomes even an identity. And then you get stuck in a rut and say, well, look, this is who I am. And it becomes very difficult. So I think the disability benefit system is part of that, but not the only thing. But I realise this is a huge topic here. I would be really interested to know how many of these people are suffering from mental health conditions like depression and anxiety, which are genuine life-limiting conditions. But the way that you handle them, the way you deal with them, can help people to escape from them or to get stuck in them. And that's what I worry about.
Do you think it is a good idea, though? Let people keep it. You do?
Yeah, for sure. Work is a moral good because it can get you out, and sometimes that actually helps with issues like depression. It depends how serious your depression is, but actually sometimes with some of the milder forms of depression, the more you can fill your life with stuff, get other things. And you're right, if you start to identify yourself as someone who has mental health issues or who has disability issues, it stops you saying what you can do and you start thinking what you can't do.
Right. I mean,
so this is an ethical good, but it's also an economic good, and we have got to try to get people back in.
Well, that, of course, seems to be the motivation, doesn't it?
Not. This is not just about economics. It's about life chances and life opportunities and actually giving people better life chances. It's fundamentally ethical and moral.
It's about the economy. It's the fact that we don't have enough people to go to work at the moment. And we've seen a huge growth in over 50s ending their work life prematurely.
That, of course, is a slightly different reason if we're talking about people who are on disability or long-term sickness. But yes, you're right. House of Lords report saying that the over 50s haven't returned to work.
The Treasury Select Committee, every time you get a panel of experts along, the first thing they will say about structural problems in our economy is that the over 50s are retiring at a rate previously unseen. And so while I think it's great that the government are thinking about what they do, it's a mistake to think it's just about benefits. It's also got to do with, we have a huge number of professionals who are leaving because they can, because they have good occupational pensions, and because they regard working in the health service or wherever to be a constant daily battle where they cannot do the job they were trained for, so they are giving up.
Well, what about the sort of cost implications, Pippa? Because someone leaves work because they're ill, they get better, they start working again. Can we afford to keep paying them sickness benefits while they do that?
I think the point is that this disincentive has been built in the system at the moment, and if you are somebody who has a condition that means that you are for long term have been sick and then want to come back to work, then you basically have to give up. They do the workplace capability assessment, which basically works out how much money you're entitled to if you're off sick to support you. You have to give up your right to that to work. And if you're trying to sort of gently find your way back into the workplace, you're not quite sure if it's for you, perhaps you've got mobility issues or you've got Down syndrome or you've got, a condition, then it might be that actually that first attempt back into the workplace doesn't work. And then suddenly you've got to go back to the beginning of the queue to get assessed. And so it's a disincentive for people to try.
Well, and Labour have proposed this too.
I totally agree. And this is, I see it with constituents who come and talk to me as well. This is not just about an economic issue.
Although why now then? Because this has been in existence for a very long time.
For sure, it's a good idea and we're doing it now. I welcome it now. Should it have been done 10 years ago? Great. I was an MP 10 years ago. I couldn't have called it to be done 10 years ago.
Actually,
I take your point.
The roll-on of benefits
let Bob finish his point and I'll come back.
Okay. I think the point is that to see this as you do as just being about economics completely misses the point. Yes, it's important economically, but actually you care about your constituents, I'm sure, as much as I do. And when I see a constituent who is basically saying, well, I'm limiting my life chances, I just feel bad for that person because I want all my lovely constituents on the Isle of Wight to have brilliant life opportunities and brilliant life chances. Right. And this is a way of getting it done. It's
a proposal, of course. It hasn't actually been agreed, but it is something that's obviously being discussed. Something else that's being discussed, but I'm told is in very, very early stages. It's the story also in the Times says the government is considering giving people tax breaks. These are the people you were talking about when they return to work, specifically for people over 50 who return to work, a 6-month holiday from income tax when they return to employment. Good idea?
If it works, yeah.
If it works, but it gets away from the fundamental issue. Yesterday, I met with a friend who was driven, has worked hard all her life. She is a psychologist for older people. She got to 60. She just gave up because the daily battle to improve the service that she could for her patients was just so hard, and she saw no hope of things getting better, that she's given up.
So what a depressing life you must lead. You're just surrounded by people who are entirely miserable and you're entirely miserable yourself. I just think you should be a bit more optimistic, Siobhan. Be a bit more optimistic about life.
I don't think we have ever had a conversation. I think people who would have had a conversation with me...
You're complaining about everything. I just think people, if all you're doing is saying everything is terrible all the time, I think people are turning off. Just giving you some advice
that people have. There's no point in not arguing or deciding what are the issues and how we actually resolve them.
All right, Timandra, what do you think of that story about giving over 50s, those who perhaps have decided, the House of Lords report says many of them affluent, that they could afford to leave the workforce early?
The cynic in me says there'll be a wave of over 50s retiring and then coming back to get the 6 months tax-free. But I do think there's a wider problem, and without getting into the specifics of people and where they work, I feel there's a general sense of people going, oh, well, what do you expect? I had a little campaign to make that the unofficial slogan of last year. And this was like public services, private companies, everyone just seemed to be going, oh, well, no, we can't do that. And the excuses move on. It went from, COVID to Putin to climate change. But there was always an excuse why they couldn't actually do the thing that is their only job, like providing energy or clean water or delivering post. Like, how can you possibly expect us to deliver post 6 days a week? It's like, well, you're the postal service. That's kind of your job. And I do worry that starting from the top, maybe, or maybe it's just everywhere in society, there's this sense of, oh, well, what do you expect? You can't expect people to actually do the things that they're meant to be doing.
Pippa?
Oh, I'm feeling a bit depressed.
No,
now.
All right, I'm going to have to...
I was a glass half full person. But I think, I think there's seriously, though, on this particular proposal, there is a big problem that people aren't talking about, which is what it does to those who are already working, and does it alienate them? And also the whole generational divide. I mean, I'm the wrong side of 50 to benefit from this, should I ever need to. But I think the people a lot younger than me already feel huge pressure, housing, their salaries, they've still got student loans, all that sort of thing. And I think it won't be great for the generational divide.
The more people we get back into the economy, the more people lead fulfilling lives, because actually a lot of work is enjoyable and people get a great sense of purpose for it. And that means we can grow the economy. That means we can cut taxes. You're right, young people have got a really duff deal. And one of the things that we absolutely need to do...
What gave them the duff deal?
One of the things we absolutely need to do nowadays is to make sure that young people get a better deal in this country. I completely...
Yeah, but do you think the government really isn't taking that issue seriously? I mean, Siobhan is right in a sense. The Conservatives have been in power since 2010, and if you think they've had a duff deal, then it can only be Conservative governments.
No, we've got a duff deal because it's an older population. We've got more focus. The NHS is clearly focused on elderly folks because they're the people who use the NHS more.
All right.
So, and look, Gordon Brown, the free bus passes, my young people on the island pay more because of Gordon Brown's policies to give free bus passes around the country.
Ask the ones who go to university and pay £9,000 a year in fees, how they feel about that.
Who introduced tuition
We introduced £3,000, which I think is entirely acceptable.
All right, enough tit for tat. And in fact, I should stop getting involved as well. Now, yesterday, we announced that the Conservative MP Andrew Bridgen was suspended for spreading misinformation about COVID vaccinations. He tweeted comparing the side effects of COVID vaccines to the Holocaust. He has tweeted before being very critical of the vaccine programme and saying they had done more damage. Those criticising him included the former Health Secretary and Independent MP Matt Hancock, who stood up and said so in the House of Commons yesterday.
Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the disgusting anti-Semitic, anti-vax conspiracy theories that have been promulgated online this morning are not only deeply offensive, but anti-scientific and have no place in this House or in our wider society?
Prime Minister. Well, can I join with my right honourable friend in completely condemning those types of comments that we saw this morning in the strongest possible terms? Obviously, it is utterly unacceptable.
Those views have no place in wider society, said Matt Hancock. Do you agree?
I think it was broadly, yes. I mean, I think it was an incredibly crass comparison to make. He shouldn't have made it. And I do not in any way defend what Andrew Bridgen said. I just thought it's just... Sorry, you shouldn't...
No, but beyond that,
okay,
do you think, though, the views that he has espoused, misinformation on vaccines, should they not be aired at all in wider society?
There is a public debate here. And whilst I disassociate myself completely from him, let me give you an example. Maybe it'd be interesting to see what Pippa says, because obviously being from The Guardian. If I had stood up during the first lockdown and said we should have gone down the Swedish model because we're going to kill more people having lockdowns and not having lockdowns, there would have been people, maybe on my own side, maybe in the Labour Party, who said he should be deselected. How can you say that? How can you attack lockdowns? You're killing old people. Actually, the Swedish model has probably resulted in the deaths of fewer people overall than the lockdowns. It's
very difficult to debate, but I take your broader point.
There is a difference between freedom of speech and saying things which are unpopular and saying things which are dumb and crass.
Pippa?
So well, I'd agree on the point that different freedom of speech is about obviously being able to present different arguments, but there's a difference between the possibly controversial but nonetheless completely valid discussion around which countries dealt with the pandemic in different ways. Obviously, Sweden had a much younger population and different demographics and all sorts. But anyway, that's a conversation we can have afterwards. No. But this is the bigger point is that this is a completely valid debate and discussion to have. What isn't is something which is quite clearly dangerous and so unscientific that it's dangerous in terms of the anti-vax conspiracy theories, which is what this was. So you're not an anti-vaxxer, which is important. But the bigger picture in all of this, I think, is about what sources of information do people trust? And we've gone from a world where people would have the BBC on their telly and a choice of 3 or 4 newspapers to a world where their sources of information are almost infinite, including not just news organisations but on social media. Many people exchange ideas and news on Facebook, for example, and that's where they'll get their information. And I think it brings a bigger question to be asked about what sources we trust for information and what responsibility those providers have. Are they publishers? Are they just platforms for the information which goes out on their platform?
Is it important to take on the argument rather than remove misinformation or at least controversial arguments that could lead to harm?
Well, I think misinformation is quite an unhelpful term because it kind of prejudges that you have information and misinformation or disinformation. So for a start, anyone that is doubtful and doesn't trust you is immediately alienated because they go, oh, well, you've just labelled me as, at best, an idiot and at worst, malicious. So I don't think that's the best way to approach it. I mean, Andrew Bridgen was just wrong about the risks from getting the vaccine are vastly outweighed by the risks of catching COVID, unless you are a healthy person in your 20s, in which case then it does start to be a genuine thing that because the risks to you of COVID are so small, then the tiny but non-zero risks from a vaccine start to be weighed with it. But I do think it's important to take it up and challenge it. I think trust is the key word here. If people do not trust a source, then that source can give them all the facts, all the arguments, all the graphs, all the figures, and they'll go, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? So it's about building a relationship of trust. And part of that is about being transparent. So early on, I think there was some reluctance to talk about the vaccines and say, this will vastly, vastly reduce your chance of becoming seriously ill and dying from COVID. But it's a non-zero risk, like all vaccines.
And does it drive people towards conspiracy theories?
I think it can.
Yes, exactly. But then you especially when they're locked down and their only source is the internet.
But then you're incumbent.
And they go, oh, well, look, I found this YouTube video that says the whole thing is a conspiracy. And they can't just go to the pub and have their mates go, Bill Gates is injecting you with a chip. Have you listened to yourself?
But that is incumbent on people getting their facts right. And as much as I respect him, when Michael Gove said we're all equally at risk, or was it Matt Hancock, that was statistically not correct. Exactly. As you've just said, that actually when you're in your early 20s, what is 32 people under 30?
Yeah, exactly. If you're in your early 20s, you're doing it altruistically to reduce, not eliminate, but reduce the chance of passing
the issue for us
is that should have been much more straightforward.
Well, hang on, let me get to one. Should they be censored then? Should these sorts of comments, that's what Matt Hancock was saying, these assertions, claims like these, should be censored?
Well, I think it's different because it's Andrew Bridgen. Andrew Bridgen, the individual citizen, has a right to express his views. Andrew Bridgen, the MP, is in a different position. He is in a leadership position, a position of trust. And I can absolutely assure you that all the anti-vaxxers out there will be using him as justification for their views. So I think we have to look at it, one, as an individual and then as an MP. So I completely agree, things you thought you'd never say, with Matt Hancock, with the Conservative Party, that he deserved to lose the whip.
And should he ever be allowed to stand again?
Well, I think that's a matter for the Conservative Party, but I would say no, because I think we're seeing the Americanisation of some of our politics with kind of the QAnon, the really mad ideas about the world that become more mainstreamed by people you trust being allowed to express these willy-nilly with no sense of responsibility.
So how best do you tackle those sorts of views that are put forward? Are people being pushed to thinking the establishment's hiding something, or there is a? I mean, how do you tackle that?
That I think is the danger, that when you say these views are beyond the pale and must be suppressed, and some social media platforms were saying, oh, this is. I mean, I thought actually some social media platforms took quite a good approach, saying, that there is some doubt about this, or this has been debunked, or whatever. So it was actually like, you can still read this, but we're just going to tell you that if you go here, you'll see a better analysis.
We have a whole load of media information services that are not regulated and that aren't subject to the same validation. And if you look at, the WhatsApp groups that were going on during lockdown, I'd get by mistake admitted to them, and I'd be saying, do you really think about this? Let's talk this through.
Well, is that the better way to deal with it? You say it shouldn't be censored.
I think it has to be that way.
Yeah,
but I think it's different if you're an MP.
Fair enough. But beyond that, you said freedom of speech shouldn't be censored.
Right. Andrew Bridgen is in trouble because he is representative of an organisation. So that's the issue. But freedom of speech, it is better to challenge than to silence as part of a broad principle.
All right, that's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests for today. I'll be back tomorrow with Politics UK at 12:15 here on BBC Two and on the BBC iPlayer. Until then, have a lovely afternoon. Bye-bye.